Hi everyone, and welcome to your full moon forecast for August 2022. So we're going to be looking at the energies of the Sturgeon full moon, which occurs on the 12th of August, and the 2 weeks that follow from that, which will take us until around about the 27th of August when we have our next new moon in Virgo. So this full moon in a lot of ways is quite a tricky one, and as we'll see when we get to the chart. There's still that Saturn-Uranus grand cross that involves the nodes, and of course Uranus and Mars. So quite a lot of tricky aspects which I get into in the cosmic calendar in more detail, where you can see how these two conflicting, positive aspects on one hand between Jupiter and Uranus and Pluto on the one hand, and then the slightly more difficult energy of this challenging grand cross that is still going to be sort of around, and I think it's going to make things feel quite high octane, particularly as we get to the full moon when emotions do tend to sort of run high anyway. So I think just bear that in mind, that it's going to possibly feel quite choppy, a little bit unpredictable, and that can always jangle nerves. But there's also a lot that's positive. There are definitely some sort of rays of sunshine, or kind of rainbow, silver linings, if you like, in amongst all that, that sort of the clouds and the thunderstorms. And I think it's just going to be holding out for those and not overreacting too much from a place of fear or anxiety. And then we move on to the fixed stars and the Arabic parts. So I've included the Arabic parts here because the moon is going to be with the Arabic part of treachery, and this is a really interesting one, given, as I say, that we have this Sun-Saturn opposition. So this Arabic part is created from various midpoints involving the Sun, the Ascendant, and Mars. And in traditional Arabic astrology, it's associated with things like betrayal and deceit. Particularly in the ancient sense of, like, if you think about Julius Caesar and Et tu, Brute, who kind of betrayed me, that type of thing. So it could be that there's a little bit of political intrigue as a result of the energies that kind of get amplified at this full moon. We've seen that already in sort of British politics. So it could be that the leadership race with the Conservative Party takes an interesting turn. But we need to add to this the fact that Jupiter, which is currently retrograde, will be making a conjunction to the lot of private enemies. So this could be, it could link whatever happens now to some kind of vendetta, possibly based on a past rivalry, a sense of resentment or a grudge, or it may just have something to do with a difference in terms of principles. So it could be like religious differences, for example. It could be sort of differences in terms of like values, or just outlook, like perspective, that there are kind of fundamental differences in terms of policy between you and somebody else. And given that we do have some slightly difficult aspects with Neptune involved, which can bring about deceit, I think I would just take care and be on my guard, so that we don't have the whirlpool over our eyes because we are a little bit confused, or somebody has created some cognitive dissonance and we're not able to sort of make clear decisions or see things to see straight. So that is something to just sort of be aware of. And I think countering this will be that Mars-Pluto trine, which should hopefully allow us, along with the Mars, the Mercury trine, which happens a few days later, it should help us to really kind of get penetrating insight, to sort of have that laser clear focus where we can cut through the BS, see into the heart of the matter, and then sort of know exactly what to do, and to sort of then act with precision and with decisiveness, and that should hopefully allow the situation to be resolved constructively. Now, of course, it's not necessarily going to play out for everybody. It will depend on whether you've got anything at 20 degrees of a fixed sign, for example, and how much this particular full moon plays into your natal chart. So, but I just wanted to kind of mention it because I think it's interesting from a mundane perspective. I think it could definitely play out in terms of politics and that sort of thing on the world stage. And then Mars, as I say, which is going to be quite active, will be with Capulus. Now, this is an interesting one. This is Capulus means handle, and this is part of the star that marks the sword hand of Perseus, the hero, in terms of constellations. Now, it's interesting because if we look at the constellation here, we can see that Perseus has got the head of Medusa in one hand, which he's kind of cut off. But on the other hand, he's holding the handle of his shield. So I think it's interesting, that Mars can sometimes be about attacking or about kind of cutting away, because, you know, it does rule things like butchery and surgery and that kind of thing. But equally, Mars can be about being defensive, about sort of not going on the offensive, but more that kind of karate energy of sort of defending yourself. So it's interesting. It could kind of work either way, and I think it will be interesting to see what happens around about the time of that Mars Pluto trine on the 14th. You know, whether you kind of forced to move into a defensive position, a strategically defensive position, so that you avoid conflict with somebody, or kind of move around a potentially difficult obstacle or situation. So it can be about male aggression or defensiveness, according to Bernadette Brady. But I think the key thing is here that you are, particularly with Mars involved, that you're doing what's necessary to deal with difficult situations or people. And that may involve strategically evading conflict. But it's also about a need to guard against acting without regard for others' feelings or the potential consequences. So the motto here is actions speak louder than words. And I think, you know, whenever Mars is involved, we are talking more about actions than kind of making decisions necessarily. But I think with Pluto in the mix, Pluto is what allows us to act strategically and to just kind of think on our feet, to be a little bit not necessarily cunning, but to act with that sort of that Metis-like energy that I sometimes talk about. You know, the street smarts that are sometimes required in order to sort of deal with unconventional situations or with people who don't play by the rules. So that's just something to bear in mind. And then finally, we've got Mercury making a parallel to Zosma. Now, this is one of the stars in the constellation of Leo. I don't think we can see Leo here. No, we can't. But according to Bernadette Brady, it's about being concerned with victims and for standing up for those who are helpless or are somehow victimized. So, you know, kind of standing up for the underdog. Or it could be about, you know, us not being a victim ourselves, because there's quite a lot in this full moon phase about empowerment and about stepping into our power. So it could be that you are either advising or defending somebody that you feel is weaker than you, or it could be that you, in fact, are standing up for yourself, you know, advocating for yourself as the sort of the underdog. So that could go sort of either way. But definitely with Mercury involved, we are talking about speech, self-expression, and thought, and as well as written sort of documents or policies or online communication, that kind of thing. So again, it could be that you sort of are having to deal with trolls or haters or critics, and I think the key thing here is not to be afraid to stand up for yourself, and to use that Mars with Capulet energy to be strategically defensive without necessarily tipping over into like overcompensation or, you know, kind of going after someone hard because you feel like they are attacking you, that kind of thing. And then we finally reached the hexagram. So it's a really interesting one. The sun will be in hexagram 4, and that's kind of interesting because hexagram 4 is a lot to do with what is kind of immature or undeveloped. So it could be a part of ourselves that we've neglected, or that where we're just not particularly strong. It's something where we may feel like we're on the kind of the back foot, where we may feel vulnerable, or where we may feel inexperienced on the one hand. And then the moon is going to be in hexagram 49, which is in the emotional center down here, which, as we know, is very much concerned with moon phase movements. And this is an interesting one because it essentially links the emotional center with the root center, the root chakra. And it forms part of the channel of sensitivity, which connects, as I say, these two things. And it's interesting because it's one of the few channels that, according to human design, we share with animals, particularly mammals. So there's an element here of kind of cross-species connection. So gate 49 is considered to be a trans-special bridge that attunes us to mammals. So it's kind of getting in touch with our animal side, our more instinctive side. And at the same time, it might also sort of it can help us to empathize with animals more. So it could be, for example, that issues around animal rights kind of come up now, and we feel more sensitive or kind of attuned to them than we would usually. It could be, for example, that you decide you want to become like a vegan or a vegetarian as a result of this. But generally speaking, it's about an emotional reaction that abolishes the old in the interest of supporting the new, because it's about the revolutionary. So it's interesting that the moon will be with Saturn, which does very often represent the old order or the old way of doing things, and that we've got Uranus, which is about to turn retrograde close to the node, which is a lot to do with incoming energies and a sense of destiny, particularly when it comes to sort of group or collective consciousness. So that kind of herd mentality. So there's something very interesting here, I think, going on for us as a species, where we are at a kind of a pivot point, where we're going to have to sort of let go of the old, and it could well be something to do with the energy transition that's sort of underway at the moment, where, you know, as a result of the war in Ukraine, we are experiencing oil and coal shortages, which in a lot of instances is forcing governments to have to look to alternative forms of energy, greener forms of energy, such as solar, wind and nuclear, in order to sort of bridge that gap and to avoid a kind of a worsening of the cost of living crisis. So it's almost as though the emotional reaction. So sometimes you know, politicians don't really act until they are concerned that they're going to lose either the vote of the electorate, or that the electorate is going to revolt, that there's going to be civil unrest. And of course, whenever you've got sort of like the potential for poverty in the mix, that's always going to sort of stir things up. So it could be that, you know, politicians now take more concerted action as far as achieving climate kind of goals and sort of zero emissions, whereas before they might have been more focused on using old mechanisms, for example, old economic mechanisms, to try and sort of like kind of buoy up or sort of hold up old systems that might be kind of creaking out of a lack of imagination or as a sort of a knee-jerk response. So it would be interesting to see, as I say, what happens in terms of energy and finances, in particular the global financial system. But I think we're being urged to really kind of drop into our emotions and to listen to what feels right, what feels in alignment with our kind of ideological principles as per that lunar phase. So it talks about the link to different bodies of knowledge. So on the one hand, you've got that very instinctive energy of the root center, which is all about survival, and it tends to sort of defer to what is known, what is familiar, what feels safe. And then you've got this more revolutionary energy that comes with the emotional wave of change. And very often this can be a collective sort of wave of change that must be timed rightly and be felt to be practical in order to have lasting merit. So, as I say, I do feel like we're at some kind of tipping point. And I think it's as a collective, we are going to have to discern or discriminate using that slightly more detached Aquarius energy about what is in the interests of the collective good, as opposed to just self-interest for ourselves and our family. What feels right for us as a species, you know, and the timing is going to be very important, you know, with, as I say, we are talking about the emotional wave, which very often moves with the lunar cycles. So I don't think we need to be in a rush to make a decision, and just allow moments to present themselves to us through this 2-week period that feel right to then take action, such as, for example, that Mars-Pluto trine on the 14th, and then, of course, the Mercury-Uranus trine that we have slightly further on. Getting into the lines, we're talking about line 2 of Hexagram 49, which is called being firm. And this is all about sticking to our principles. So it's about envisioning right outcomes for change. So in other words, really, you know, choosing the high road. So if we are going to make some kind of transition, making sure that it's in the interests of all concerned, recognizing that change is needed, we then need to hold firm to our principles or to act for change's sake. And a lot will depend on what feels like the right thing to do. So it's a pivot point or a fork in the road that's all about choosing with integrity. So quite an interesting one, as I say, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of is announced or that happens in this 2-week period that acts as a kind of a catalyst, because that's certainly possible given that, you know, the involvement of the nodes with that grand cross. It can bring about a kind of creative tension that forces change, where we as a collective are made to feel so uncomfortable that there's almost no alternative, where we have to then, you know, kind of move in a different direction.